Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight. Hope you're all well. Hello, Dolores. Steve Wolfbrandt, nice to see you. She says, "Where's our stinking badges?" And Dolores says, "Hi, all." Joanne, hi. And Dolores is sharing. Yes, please, everybody, share as much as you can. Kay says, "Hi, everybody. Glad to see you." Steve Gonzo says, "Australian Open tennis. Oi, oi, oi." Why, oi, oi, oi? I suppose Australia could have open tennis, right? Are they social distancing in the stadium? He says, "I can't stay. A previous engagement. Perhaps I'll catch the end." Shared. Please do come back and catch the end, and thank you for coming and for sharing, Steve. That's very good. Anyway, here we are. There's a lot of ins and outs related to the relief bill that I want to discuss. So let me first mention that I've decided not to do the healthcare topics I was going to cover tonight because I think we have enough just to do the relief and impeachment. There's just a lot to discuss there. So as many of you probably know, the CBO has decided that the minimum wage provision within the relief bill will have a budgetary impact, that it does have a budgetary impact. They see it as increasing the deficit, increasing unemployment over 10 years by 1.4 million, but also raising wages generally and lifting 900,000 people out of poverty. Bernie Sanders says he has a room full of lawyers to try to persuade the CBO that the minimum wage provision can be included in the reconciliation bill. I don't think he's going to need to use the room full of lawyers to convince them, but he'll probably need to have the room full of lawyers talk to the parliamentarian of the Senate, who may or may not be persuadable, but he'd sure like to have the parliamentarian on his side so he doesn't have to convince the White House and Kamala Harris that she ought to overrule the parliamentarian in keeping the minimum wage provision inside of the reconciliation bill. It is amazing that CBO's claims about the deficit aren't having very much impact on Capitol Hill thus far. Now, that in part, I think, is due to the fact that many, many other people outside of the CBO are lambasting the CBO projections concerning the increase to unemployment. There are other institutions that have done projections already, and their by their projections, show a gain of employment, and they also show that it's not going to increase the deficit. On the contrary, it's going to have a positive impact on the deficit. And given the CBO's track record of being able to successfully project, I'm afraid that I tend to agree more with the other organizations that have been coming up with other ideas about what's going to happen if the minimum wage is put into the bill. So that said, the House draft legislation now contains the minimum wage provision going up to $15 an hour by 2025. The first increase for next year, if it passes, would increase the minimum wage from $7.25 to $9.25. And so then there are 3 more increases to go. That's probably a little too slow, $7.25 to $9.25, and $9.25 to $11.25, and $11.25 to $13.25, and finally the rest of the way to $15. But still, that's certainly a gain, and much better than not having the minimum wage inside of the reconciliation bill, okay, at all. Furthermore, it looks like for the time being, the argument within the Democratic Party, that is in the White House, in the House, okay, and in the Senate, concerning the eligibility for the relief checks, for the survival checks, or maybe you want to call them stimulus checks, I don't know, the checks, the direct payments to individuals that are going to be going out, things are looking good on the eligibility side. The arguments that the eligibility rules should be changed on those seems to, for the moment, have been rejected by the White House, probably on political grounds, that it would look very, very bad if people got some checks from Donald Trump as he was getting out of office, and a large number of people who got those checks, some 40 to 45 million people who got those checks, were not getting checks from Joe Biden because they had been cut out by the changes in the eligibility rules. So it looks like Biden is going to support the older limits, okay, on who's eligible for the checks, and won't be tightening them. So it seems like progressives have won that battle on both policy and political stupidity grounds. So that said, what I now want to do is look at some of the arguments that may have been successful, that I think were successful and that were important. First, let's take a look at the American Prospect on February 8th, and Dave Dayen's column, always a must each day. This is the first 100 column, of course, and let me share that for you. So, you probably know or have heard that Larry Summers has been trying to torpedo the $1.9 trillion plan. his grounds for speaking out against it and for writing in the Washington Post, against it, is that he thinks there's a big risk that it's going to be inflationary. Now, he's not clearly outlined his theory of inflation to back those particular claims, but he just talks about his worries and his concerns and how bad it might be if it caused inflation in the same way as we had inflation during the 1970s. Of course, he ignores the fact that the inflation we had during the 70s was a cost push inflation caused by price rises by the supplier. And that right now, if this bill were to cause inflation, it would not be about supply and cost push. It would be about demand pull inflation. He also neglects the fact that we haven't had any kind of serious demand pull inflation since the Second World War. Not since the Second World War in the United States have we had that kind of inflation, and certainly not since we got off the gold standard in 1971. There hasn't been any demand pull inflation. In his discussion of this, Larry Summers never even mentions the important distinction between a cost push inflation and a demand pull inflation. Over the years, Summers has developed a reputation as an extremely bright man. And when he's in debates with others, he does seem to be extremely bright. But when you really look into what he's saying and you look at the theoretical underpinnings of what he's saying, it seems like there's no there. Not really. Anyway, despite his best efforts, says Dave Dayen, doesn't look like there's much in the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan that's going to change from Joe Biden's initial proposal. And Dave says the Senate parliamentarian will determine the fate of the $15 an hour proposal for minimum wage. And he says Biden is being rather defeatist in predicting it won't make it, considering the budgetary impact is as much as $500 billion. Now that, of course, is based on a well, I don't think that's based on CBO, actually. But in any case, this may also doom the paid leave sections of the bill and the 3,000 to 3,600 annual child allowance, though if, quote, giving money to families with kids doesn't have a direct budget impact, we have to rethink the whole process. Yes, of course, all of these are going to have direct impacts on the budget. I don't know about this depending on the parliamentarian of the Senate, though, since the parliamentarian can be overruled by Kamala Harris, can be overruled by the presiding officer. So either Harris, no, I guess in this case it has to be Harris. It has to be the VP. Can't simply be the presiding officer. Because the presiding officer, if he's the president pro tempore of the Senate, would just be another senator who would be voting in favor of the bill in any case because he's a Democratic senator. So the real variable, says Dave, is whether direct payments to Americans will have the same means test threshold as in prior COVID relief bills, it will be narrowed, phasing out beginning at 50,000 rather than 75,000. We now know that is not going to happen. At least that is not in the House draft. The House draft, after consultation with Joe Biden and after consultation with the Senate, has the $75,000 limit and $150,000 for couples. So Janet Yellen's split the difference idea of doing 60,000 didn't change any minds in the administration, even though, of course, she's a part of the administration. For all the attempts to make this a matter of economics, it's really a political question, which appears to be the way Biden has looked at it. So Dave makes the point that whatever one thinks of the idea that some rich families might be getting a government check, the issue is more a political question, because what should be the much bigger fear of voters who got the first two checks actually missing out on the third and properly blaming the new administration for their missing out. Jeff Merkley of Oregon says, if Democrats want to so clearly break a campaign promise and lose all the momentum they gained in Georgia last month, that's on them. That's what Jeff said, and he was right. The public doesn't actually care about undeserving check by recipients. This is an elite political obsession that's going to randomly hurt a lot of people, and Dave was right about that. And I suspect that his column might have had an influence on what went on in discussions, because I think a lot of people have been reading his columns of late. But because political elites would rather see themselves motivated by facts and logic, they've attempted to shoehorn an economic rationale for tightening the means tests and leaving 45 million or so Americans without a full check. They've zeroed in on a study from Raj Chetty, Chetty, could be Chetty, which claims to prove that the second check, the $600 one approved in December and sent out in early January, not to us, we're approaching the middle K of February yet, and one of our $600 checks is not here, was not spent in the first couple of weeks by households making more than $78,000 a year. We make just a fraction of that, but by the way, and I can tell you, we certainly weren't able to spend it because we didn't even get it. So that's that. But anyway, everyone favoring more targeted checks cites the Chetty analysis to prove their point, including the aforementioned Mr. Summers, says Dave. Opportunity Insights, Chetty's Harvard-based organization, is well funded by very rich interests like Mark Zuckerberg, and has the ear of official Washington. I've already covered how the economics of the Chetty analysis are just wrong. Whether a transfer payment is spent immediately is not indicative of whether it's worthwhile. Also, reducing debt is not a poor use of funds either. But the analysis is quietly controversial in economic circles for a different reason. This study of the spending habits of low and middle income households isn't based on household level income data, unquote. According to their technical appendix, it's based on data from Affinity Solutions, which only has zip code level data. They have credit card and debit card activity, but that data are sorted by the zip code associated with the card. Then the zip codes are divvied up using the Census Bureau's American Community Survey, uh, the estimates of zip code median household income from that survey. The only way you get to the conclusion that low-income people spent the check quickly and higher-income people didn't, in other words, is by saying that zip codes that had lower-income people in them between 3 and 7 years ago contained a higher level of immediate spending than zip codes with higher-income people during this period. All of this time, of course, 3 years ago to 7 years ago, predates the pandemic. As Lindsay Owens, interim executive director of the Groundwork Collaborative, told me, quote, there is absolutely no reason to be nickel and diming families, many of whom have seen their incomes drop since 2019 on the size of the promised checks, unquote. So Dave asked Opportunity Insights about that, and they acknowledged the distribution of incomes change with each zip code over time and as people move. But they expressed confidence that the 2019 distribution of incomes is similar to the American Community Survey zip code data, that since employment rates have fully recovered at the top end of the income distribution, that the zip code for the top households is fairly consistent. So zip code data is used fairly commonly in microeconomics, and you could make a somewhat plausible case that this proxy works. But lots of economists have problems with it. Claudia Sam said, I think the paper is unsuitable for the policy discussion, quote unquote. She's a former Federal Reserve and Council of Economic Advisors economist. And she said, quote, it's one paper at odds with 20 years of research, unquote. She noted only one household level spending and income data would be appropriate to draw the kinds of conclusion the paper reaches. The sampling errors in the ACS data are pretty high. Quote, I know the sampling error has to be in the thousands of dollars. There's no way it's that precise, unquote, Sam said. There's also potentially significant variation of income within zip codes, a point that census economist John Voorhees had made on Twitter. The Opportunity Insights data is presently implicitly as if the income variation is presented implicitly as if the income variation doesn't apply. Quote, according to Voorhees, quote, this means there's such severe income segregation that the only possible conclusion from your research is to burn the whole thing down and start over, unquote. So, serious criticisms of the Opportunity Insights study, which, by the way, was summarized, according to one columnist, in 1 page, and to another columnist in 2 pages, and it was discussed for a number of days before the data was actually released so people could see what this study was actually based on. According to Sam, this whole discussion is happening in the midst of a live discussion with major policy implications. And she says, quote, frankly, it's irresponsible what they're doing with the data. The research is not solid, and it's presented in a way that's irresponsible and wrong, unquote. And you can believe the general story, as economist Dean Baker does, that higher income households are doing pretty good in this economy, which would lead you to the same conclusion as Chetty's data. But applying this fine-grained analysis to a means test threshold would still be a leap of faith. That's before you get to the obvious point that we have no way to apply a specific income threshold means test because the only tax data we have is from 2019. And of course, we're talking about the COVID period, which was in 2020. So, that's what we're dealing with here. JP Morgan Chase, using its own credit and debit card data, has also put out some analyses of spending habits in this form. And reportedly, their upcoming analysis of the second of the relief checks will not show the same thing as Chetty's work, which is interesting. That uses household level income statistics, and the spending series was developed for 6 years to fine-tune it to spit out real-time data. Opportunity Insights has only developed its tracker in the last year. And there's been pushback to the Chetty-driven concept of further means testing the checks, not just the expected kind from the left, but pushback from Lisa Blunt Rochester, who's a Democrat from Delaware, and also David McKinley, a Republican from West Virginia. They pointedly introduced a bill last Friday with the original phase-out levels. Rochester was a co-chair of Biden's campaigns. John Ossoff, who campaigned on the check, said to HuffPost, "I don't want to see any reductions in the help we're sending to people." So Biden has held back the forces of austerity on most counts early in his presidency, but he's left open the questions of means testing the checks. I'd say that's not so open anymore since the appearance of the House draft, of legislation. I think Nancy Pelosi would not have come in with that if Biden felt the question was still open. And I think on political grounds, he doesn't think it's open anymore. And another quote from Psalm to end this: "If I knew what families really needed this money, I'd send it to them," unquote. And quote again, "The reality is we do not know. Stop pretending that you know," unquote, is what she said. And she, of course, is quite right. Stop pretending that you know. You can't know because the 2020 data is not there. So next up is another article, this one from September 7th from the Daily Poster. So a couple of days ago, still not completely current, but trust me, we'll get there. This article was by Andrew Perez and by Walker Bragman. But from the Daily Poster, "The check would mean a lot." That's a quote. They sort of focus on anecdotal evidence from various people. One Jay, who's 42, says, quote, "I'm basically just treading water," said. He'd been working in the live event industry in Texas since 2016. He was largely living paycheck to paycheck due to student loan debt and rent, but he was comfortable and he loved his work. But the pandemic hit and caused the cancellation of live events around the country. He held on to his job longer than many in the industry, but he was furloughed in September. He said, "My income has been cut in more than half, and I can only pay rent, bills, and eat. That's it. Rent is ridiculously expensive in Austin. I make bulk meals to stretch my dollar that way. I've canceled most subscriptions to everything, and I don't have cable. I've foregone purchases to replace old clothes, dishes, and other consumable goods." Now, Jay is worried that because he earned $61,000 in 2019, he won't get a full $1,400 survival check in the mail if Democrats in Washington follow through on their proposal to limit eligibility for a new round of COVID impact payments. So Jay's story is not an isolated incident. Uh, and there are some other anecdotes in this. Of course, the article also goes through what had been being considered in terms of the means testing and the idea that it was going to exclude 40 million people for paychecks. It's not clear whether it's 40 million people or 45 million people. I've even seen an estimate as high as 80 million people who would not be getting checks as a result of this. But 40 to 45 million people being angry at the Democrats is enough. I guess Biden also thought that was enough. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said, "We cannot cut off relief at 50K. It is shockingly out of touch to assert that 50K is too wealthy to receive any relief." She said that millions are on the brink of eviction. That was last Friday she said this. She said, "Give too little and they're devastated. Give too much and a single mom might save for a rainy day. This isn't hard." Yep. AOC knows when it's hard and when it's not. And she's more representative because her district is in New York, where prices are very, very high. Even the guy in Austin was complaining, but Austin is a relatively low-cost area compared to New York. So, Senators Ron Wyden and Jeff Merkley both oppose the new income limits. And you know Merkley has warned, don't break the promise, don't break the promise. Okay. But getting back to more people quoted in this article, we talked about Jay. So let's get to a few more of them. Of course, Joe Manchin is mentioned, okay, in this article, and a few others. I'm stepping by that because I've covered that in other streams. There's Liz, a nonprofit fundraiser in New York City. She earned $66,000 in 2019. Lost her job at the end of 2020. She's fortunate enough to have some savings and live in a rent-stabilized apartment. She hasn't started receiving her unemployment benefits yet, and her Social Security won't kick in until later this year. I don't know what she gets from Social Security exactly, but she said that $1,400 would mean a great deal to me. I'm not going to starve. I'm not going to get evicted yet, but I need the money, unquote. John worked in marketing in the field of mental and behavioral health care before the pandemic, making nearly $70,000. But most of it went to paying off his medical and student debt. Last March, John was laid off. He has little savings and has not been able to find work since. Quote, "This first stimulus under Biden would be the first I didn't qualify for," unquote, he said to the Daily Poster. Then he said, quote, "The check would mean a lot. My wife and I live with my family, and obviously that isn't ideal. And I still have needed to go to therapy. I need to go to the doctor. I need to pay my medication, my various bills, etc. An extra stimulus, while $1,400 is modest compared to other nations, would at least provide a stronger foundation for my wife and I to move forward with our lives," unquote. Quote, "Not to mention my health insurance at $400 a month could be covered for 3 months," unquote, he added. Using older financial data on past rounds of checks has already kept some Americans who qualify for checks from receiving the money they should be owed. Chris, 35, has been living alone for 2 years, working a steady job for a utility company and living in a sizable 2-bedroom apartment. But that changed in November of 2019 after an on-the-job back injury. Unable to work despite 2 surgeries, he lost $110,000 in annual income and found himself on workman's compensation, relying heavily on credit cards, savings, and roommates. He says, quote, the workers' comp is great and all, but it doesn't pay my bills. My savings account is gone. I was forced to get roommates after living alone for many years, and my credit card debt is through the roof now. After the pandemic hit, he never received the past 2 economic impact payments authorized by Congress because of his 2019 income. If Congress uses 2019 tax returns in order to determine eligibility for new checks, he worries he could face exclusion again. And he can. He probably will, because unless he quickly files his 2020 tax return, they're going to base this on his 2019 income, on that tax return. But during the campaign, of course, I had my doubts, said Liz. But I was hopeful that the Biden-Harris administration would really get it, give up some of their comfort, and do the right thing for the American people. Quote, hope is for suckers, unquote, she said. So that's the way people are feeling. Okay, I think Biden has to respond to that. Okay, and quickly. And next, there's another piece by the great Dave Dayen. And that's called The House Sets the Marker. And it's another column in the First 100 series. It is current as of today. The major media debate about the $1.9 trillion American rescue plan involves the overall size of the package, driven largely by Larry Summers' anger over getting blackballed from the Biden campaign last summer. That's not actually much of debate because the decision makers are all aligned. That means Biden, Schumer, and Nancy Pelosi are all aligned. It's very unlikely that the U.S. will pass an additional $1.9 trillion, very likely that the United States will pass an additional $1.9 trillion or so of relief, mostly focused on helping low and middle income people survive the pandemic and getting everyone vaccinated as quickly as possible. And they're going to do it in the next month or so. Summers had no impact on this, and that is as it should be, says Dave. Financial markets and Federal Reserve officials don't see much risk from inflation. And by the way, MMT economists don't see much risk either from inflation. Summers' fear of an overheating economy is based on bad math and a seeming desire to keep a large section of the population in financial pain. That this is being rejected should be celebrated. It's not 2009 anymore, says Dave. Thank God. That said, there's a debate happening inside Congress over the fate of one key component of the bill and the structure of another. About 90% of the bill is going to get through relatively unscathed in the form Joe Biden presented it before the inauguration. The remaining 10% really matters, so we're focused on it. And yesterday, the House made key decisions on both pieces. But yesterday we discussed the debate over what level to phase out the direct payments. I explained how a different economist, Raj Pachetti, triggered this debate by airdropping a two-page research paper based on imprecise, outdated zip code level data to, quote, prove, unquote, that nobody above 78,000 spent stimulus money. But nobody above 78,000 got a full stimulus check, but somehow that never gets said. Economist Claudia Sahm, who I quoted extensively in my piece, wrote an even more thorough takedown of the Chetty paper, but Claudia and I didn't end up on the op-ed page of the New York Times, as Chetty and his fellow researchers did yesterday, given the space to present the research again and preemptively rebut critics. That they felt the need to do this shows that a real debate is forming. But the role of elite media is pushing through Chetty's narrative is notable. The research first gained attention in a Washington Post spread on January 26th with a very explicit headline, quote, cutting off stimulus checks to Americans earning over $75,000 could be wise, new data suggests. Nowhere in that story does it mention using zip code level rather than household level data. In fact, the technical appendix explaining the data source isn't linked in the paper until a week later, a week after January 26th. When the paper finally starts to get some criticism, the New York Times gives it an unmediated op-ed. The only disclosure of the zip code level data is in a caption to a chart. Did I mention that influential New York Times op-ed columnist Dave Leonard sits on the advisory board for Opportunity Insights? By the way, Dave Leonard is an Austerian from way back. He's written some stuff that is pure Peter G. Peterson, recycling the insights of the deficit hawk mavens. Anyway, he sits on the advisory board for Chetty's umbrella group that produced this analysis. The second major variable in the bill is whether the increase in the minimum wage to $15 an hour will be added. Dave says it's mostly a function of whether the parliamentarian allows it in the reconciliation process. In other words, the parliamentarian has to agree that it has a significant impact on the budget. And Dave says that was likely to hinge on a CBO analysis of the legislation, whether they took the budget implications into account. That report dropped yesterday, and there's good news and bad news. The bad news is it's just a terrible report. It assumes that while 27 million people would get a raise, there would be 1.4 million jobs lost over 10 years, so that sounds a lot bigger than it is. That plays havoc with all the budgetary implications. There are, in other words, that assumption plays havoc with all the budgetary implications. There are higher unemployment insurance costs, higher interest on the national debt, and higher prices for goods and services baked in. Basically, CBO tried to model the entire economy and national expenditures based on this one change. In other words, their estimate that would be 1.4 million jobs lost, which of course was based on some terrible theory, really outdated. It also based that model on arbitrarily choosing 7 research studies concerning minimum wage increases and then overemphasizing the negative ones, as Aaron Dubé explains. Uh, um, Aaron Dubé is actually it's Arindrajit Dubé from the University of Massachusetts. I hope I pronounced that correctly.
What does that mean?
Oh, that's his name.
Oh.
If CBO used the methodology it used in 2019 to look at a previous minimum wage bill, it would have shown a $1.1 million job loss. Instead, it showed 1.4 million, and that drift is completely at odds with the latest research. A fiery call from the Economic Policy Institute yesterday savaged the CBO score. Quote, "Normally, we don't like to yell at the referees," said AFL-CIO economist Bill Spriggs. Quote, "But in this regard, the CBO has stepped outside its bounds and is not speaking truth to power, but is giving information that is misleading. I wrote 2 years ago," Dave says, "that CBO was going to be a problem, though you get no points for being first or right. But that leads us to the good news. Ultimately, CBO shows that the wage hike would cost the government $54 billion in a 10-year window, when contemporaneous analyses showed budget savings of close to $500 billion. So that's how far CBO is off some of the other estimates. There are many progressive economists who disagree with that analysis. Nevertheless, a budget impact is a budget impact, and the Senate parliamentarian will have to disallow something more than twice the size of closing the carried interest loophole, for example, if they choose to nullify the minimum wage hike from the reconciliation bill. All this is preamble to what the House did yesterday afternoon. The Ways and Means and Education Labor Committees released their preliminary text of the reconciliation bill, which will be marked up this week. Education Labor kept the minimum wage hike in, and Ways and Means kept the phase-outs for direct payments starting at $75,000 a year for individuals and $150,000 for couples. Dave adds, "Some people are trying to make hay about a faster phase-out, quote unquote, but it's really not much faster. The previous checks reduced the value by $5 for every $100 over the threshold. This phase-out would reduce value by, wait for it, $5.60 for every $100. It's not really a difference made just to get around a number cutoff at $100,000 and $200,000, $100,000/$200,000. So House leadership, in other words, ignored the cries to tighten the means test, recognized the anger middle-class voters would have if they qualified for two previous checks and not this one, just kept the structure in place. The structure is still flawed. Either 2019 or 2020 earnings data can be used for the checks, depending on when it passes and when the individuals file taxes. So there's still a burden on individuals to manage the system to maximize their payout. The means test based on outdated income data makes no sense. It's a major problem in the new version of the child tax credit too, but it's not needlessly restrictive. Okay, the new version of the child tax credit, by the way, specifies $3,600 per year for each child from 0 to 6. And for children who are over 6, from 6 to 17, that goes down to $3,000. But there's a wrinkle. There's a wrinkle in the bill, which I gather Biden wanted, and that is that the tax credit will be refunded to parents on a monthly basis. So for each child over 6, from 6 to 17, they would get $250 a month for 12 months, and the $3,600 from 0 to 6 would be $300 a month for every child. So if there are 2 children, it's $600 a month in the form of a direct payment. That's pretty substantial. That helps to bring up a child. The Senate can still and probably will still put their mark on this, but the House set an early baseline, and we'll see if that passes through the markups. I know the Progressive Caucus organized to include both of these pieces. The leadership could have punted right away on both these questions, and they didn't. They gave in to the Progressive Caucus. Since checks and the minimum wage are super popular, it gives progressives more time to build support and rebut contrasting arguments. It allows the important elements, both policy-wise and politically, to have a fighting chance. So now the last piece on relief is from Dave Sirota. Actually, it's from Julia Rock, Andrew Perez, and Dave Sirota. It's also from the Daily Poster. And it points to the fact that was hinted at by Dave Dayen. Okay, the title of it is "The Beltway Media is Manufacturing Consent." Okay, and it's a great piece. It said it's not a revelation that elite outlets in the media bake ideology into their news coverage and manufacture consent. In fact, a new poll shows Americans sense the scam and are well aware that something is deeply rotten in the news industry. However, the press-driven discourse about promised $2,000 survival checks offers something new and rare, an unvarnished glimpse of exactly how this consent manufacturing process works in real time. When you follow the money behind the process, you invariably find yourself where most truth seekers end up in American life, staring into the deadened eyes of billionaires who like things just the way they are. In 2016, Senator Warren sounded an alarm about so-called, quote, cognitive capture, warning that the information ecosystem in Washington has been systemically corrupted, allowing unseen interests to use think tanks and media to manipulate the assumptions upon which public policy decisions are based. So a few years later, that is exactly what is playing out. Millionaire pundits paid by billionaire media moguls are once again trying to protect millionaire politicians bankrolled by billionaire donors. Marshalling studies produced by billionaire think tanks, they have a goal: denying survival aid to middle-class thousandaires now facing an economic apocalypse. The whole episode conjures Charles Foster Kane, the leading character from Citizen Kane, if you remember that movie, boasting that people will think what he tells them to think. That is arguably often considered the greatest movie ever made by quite a number of aficionados, aficionados of the movies. In any case, because he who pays the piper calls the tune. And in this case, the song is that golden oldie, quote, nothing will fundamentally change, unquote. The sordid tale started in December, a few days after Congress passed the bipartisan stimulus package that was awaiting Donald Trump's signature. When Trump demanded Congress revise the legislation to boost direct payments from $600 to $2,000, House Democrats quickly called his bluff and passed a bill to increase the checks from $600 to $2,000. Yes, okay, it was AOC who I believe wrote that bill, and the House Democrats quickly passed it. That's when the media's consent consent manufacturing regime, or I should say machine, kicked into high gear. Larry Summers, former Treasury Secretary and head of the National Economic Council, went on to Bloomberg TV and declared, quote, I don't think the $2,000 checks makes much sense, unquote. He added, I'm not even sure I'm so enthusiastic about the $600 checks, and I think taking them to $2,000 would actually be a pretty serious mistake that would risk a temporary overheat, which means that the economy could exceed its capacity, and that could lead to inflation. Summers was reprising his destructive role in limiting economic stimulus in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, which delivered the weakest economic recovery in modern American history. But that context was never mentioned by any media outlets covering his new austerity edicts, nor was it mentioned that he himself had said that he was in error in 2009 and admitted that that stimulus was too small. So here he is coming back again, urging a smaller stimulus, than others, because he's so confident that he's always right, in spite of the fact that he admitted in 2009 that he was wrong. In fact, he was not only wrong in 2009, he's been wrong about everything since the Clinton administration. Going on. Instead, Bloomberg amplified his message, publishing another Summers op-ed in which he insisted, quote, there is no good economic argument for the $2,000 checks. Jeff Bezos' newspaper, that is another billionaire's newspaper, quickly followed suit, an even richer billionaire than Bloomberg, quickly followed suit with an editorial headline, quote, why increasing the stimulus checks from $2,000 is a bad idea. The Washington Post editorial claimed without evidence that the stimulus legislation, quote, showered billions on people who suffered little or no lasting hardship from the pandemic. The Post argued that targeting, quote, modest payments to the hardest hits, low-income segments of the population would have made more sense. As the Daily Poster reported at the time, these pundits supplied then Senate Majority Leader with the talking points he used as he refused to put the House $2,000 checks bill up for a vote. But while the bill never moved in the Senate, Biden and other top Democrats realized how popular $2,000 check proposals was and ran with it. Biden and Democrats continued to campaign on the $2,000 checks even after the $600 payments started going out with Trump's name on them. Almost immediately after the Senate victories in Georgia were announced, Biden pivoted, explaining that $2,000 checks would actually be new $1,400 checks that, when combined with $600 checks from the December stimulus, would add up to, a quote, a total of $2,000 in direct relief, unquote. So word parsing to reduce the checks, though, apparently wasn't enough. say the author, is now a second wave of propaganda has manufactured a debate over further reducing direct aid by limiting eligibility. This campaign kicked off on January 26th when the Post started to boost the study that we now know was the Chetty study, the Opportunity Insight study that Dave Day and talked about. So you know about that. So I will skip through this part. And so the authors say here, the suggested change wasn't some small minor tweak. Their suggestions could deny or reduce aid to nearly half of Americans, according to census data. While the pandemic has hit lower income households particularly hard, that same census data shows that 45% of households earning between 50,000 and 150,000 have lost employment income since the pandemic started. There's another major problem with cutting people out this way. Most Americans' payments will go out based on their 2019 income unless they file their 2020 tax returns early and the IRS processes their filings before sending out these checks once Congress passes them. Such means testing could deny aid to millions of people whose lives were upended by the pandemic. But the media outlets jumped at the chance to limit aid. Biden's stimulus risks giving the money to people who won't spend it, Bloomberg's headline blared, citing the Opportunity Insight study. And Catherine Rand Powell, that austerity mugger from the Post, wrote her own column on the study with the headline, "It is not progressive to give money to the rich," unquote. As if she herself was getting any money from the stimulus bill. I don't think she did. Michael Bloomberg, he gets paid too much by the Post. Anyway, Michael Bloomberg's money manager, Steve Ratner, who a decade ago agreed to pay $10 million to settle claims he paid bribes to win state pension business, helped lead an absolutely shameless segment on Morning Joe based around the Opportunity Insights study, arguing it raises significant questions about the size of the stimulus checks and who could get them for $450 billion that President Biden has proposed. And there's a Vimeo video for that I'm not going to play, but tellingly, these news outlets and pundits have expressed no similar outrage or concern about Democratic leaders concurrently pushing new tax deductions that would give 80% of their benefits to the richest 5% of the country because, hey, let the serfs eat salt, which is, that's an acronym for the provision that would give 80% of benefits to the richest 5% of the country. The media distorted discourse has had its intended reverberations in the halls of power. Last week, a group of Republican senators billed moderates offered their own COVID relief proposal with $1,000 checks that would start to phase out at $40,000 for individuals and $80,000 for married couples, apparently excluding struggling families from aid during a pandemic is now moderate, quote unquote. At the same time, Biden suggested that he was open to negotiating the issue, and top White House economic advisors reportedly were concerned about the size of the stimulus and at what income level the stimulus checks would be phased out. The Washington Post soon reported the White House was considering starting to phase out payments for individuals making more than $50,000 or married couples making more than $100,000. A change that would deny aid to 40 million Americans. There's the old saying that a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. In this situation, the media elites moved a half-baked study all the way around Washington decision desks and roundtables while its key details were kept under wraps. Indeed, while the Opportunity Insight story was cited in, among others, CBS News, Fox Business, CNBC, and Forbes, none of the coverage looked into details of the data being used by the group, probably because the technical appendix wasn't added to the one-page study online until last Thursday, more than a week after the study started making headlines. And upon close inspection, the appendix undermines those headlines. The study is supposed to show that higher income households didn't experience much of a spending boost from previous stimulus checks, but the study extrapolates household income from zip code level income data that is at least a couple of years old, Dave Dayen reported on Monday. And then they quote, but Dave, so you've heard that before. Former Federal Reserve National Economic Council economist Claudia Salm said Monday that the study, which is not peer-reviewed, contradicts the majority of peer-reviewed studies on the topic. So no peer review for this wonderful study either. She says it's at odds with over a decade of peer-reviewed research, including my own, and unsupported by the underlying data they used for their analysis. That research, some wrote, shows that income is not a very good predictor of who will spend stimulus payments. And she says, Chetty's paper is an outlier in over a decade of research in which income is not a strong predictor of who will spend the checks. Some studies show that lower income families spend less of their checks, but no one has argued that high income families spend next to nothing out of their checks, as Raj is suggesting. More commonly across studies, it's having little or nothing in your bank account, referred to as low liquidity, that's associated with more spending out of stimulus checks, unquote. Despite these obvious flaws, on Monday, the New York Times gave the Opportunity Insights economists their own column to tout the study and their findings, not disclosing that New York Times writer David Leonard serves on Opportunity Insights Advisory Board and has been helping, he said, she said, and has been helping, he said, and she said, the debate over the checks. The economists wrote, their data provides politicians with the information they need to make informed decisions, and that lawmakers had shown an interest in their data on the stimulus checks. Some progressives in Congress seem to sense that the media-driven push to limit direct aid is gaslighting the Democratic Party into enraging millions of middle-class voters who were promised a check. And a number of people comment on this, specifically Ron Wyden, Jeff Merkley, Bernie Sanders, John Ossoff, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Pramila Jayapal. And AOC tweeted that the debate Democrats should be having is how much more, quote unquote, we should be helping people this year, not how much less. And as you know, on Monday, Richie Neal and Democratic leaders in the House released their COVID relief legislation, which would send $1,400 checks to individuals earning up to $75,000 and married couples earning up to $150,000. Still unclear what the Senate will do. And Biden, of course, as you know, has gone from unequivocally promising immediate 2,000 checks to $1,400 checks. Sensing an opportunity to trick Democrats into further abandoning their promises, Republican Senator Portman has now returned to the pundit who originally kicked off the effort to stop the checks. He touted Larry Summers' declarations as proof that the stimulus must be slashed. Signal boosting a Wall Street Journal editorial that was echoing the argument. The process had come full circle. A media-boosted pundit who manufactured the original fraudulent argument against the survival checks had returned to center stage, having been injected again into the political conversation by a lawmaker wielding talking points provided by an elite news outlet. The legislative details had changed, but the consent, the manufacturing machine's goal is the same: convincing us to cheer on politicians who block promised aid during a catastrophe. A great editorial piece, I think, and very straight as well. Let us move on to impeachment. A great piece by Norman Solomon in Common Dreams. And Norman says, hidden in plain sight, the unimpeachable offenses. Okay, this appeared February 8th in Common Dreams. But Norman Solomon was a campaign surrogate for Bernie Sanders. And he said, impeachment dramas on Capitol Hill have routinely skipped over a question we should be willing to ask, even if Congress won't. Quote, what about a president's unimpeachable offenses, unquote. The question is the flip side of one that Republican General Ford candidly addressed when he was the minority leader of the House 50 years ago. He said, quote, what then is an impeachable offense? The only honest answer is that an impeachable offense is whatever a majority of the House of Representatives considers it to be at a given moment of history, unquote. By narrowly defining which offenses are impeachable, okay, the political elites are implicitly telling us which offenses are not impeachable. Anyway, Norman wrote in The Hill on February 6, 2017, less than 3 weeks into Trump's term, quote, from the outset of his presidency, Trump has been violating the U.S. Constitution in a way we have not seen before and should not tolerate. It's time for members of Congress to get the impeachment process underway. I pointed out that, quote, the president continues to violate two emoluments clauses in the Constitution. One prohibits any gifts or benefits from foreign governments, and the other prohibits the same from the U.S. government or any U.S. state. But at the outset, treating President Trump as unimpeachable, despite those flagrant violations of the Constitution, greased the wheels for the runaway madness of his presidency in the years that followed. As Trump's destructive joyride went on, reasons to impeach him proliferated. Researchers easily drew up dozens of articles of impeachment. But in the eyes of political elites, as with previous presidents, Trump's offenses were seen as unimpeachable. 2 decades earlier, Bill Clinton became the second impeached president in U.S. history. The frenzy was akin to vilifying Al Capone for tax evasion. Quote, We all seem to have lost our sense of proportion. Historian Howard Zinn wrote 5 weeks before Clinton's impeachment, quote, "Why are the political leaders of the United States and the major media talking of impeaching Bill Clinton for lies about sex? Surely not the most important sins of his administration." Writing in November 1998, Zinn added, "If Clinton is to be impeached, why do it for frivolous reasons? I can think of at least 10 reasons to impeach him for acts far more serious than his dalliance with Monica Lewinsky or his lies to Kenneth Starr. I am speaking of matters of life and death for large numbers of people." Zinn cited such matters as missile attacks on Iraq, Afghanistan, and Sudan, Clinton's refusal to accept the Canadian proposal to ban to ban landmines, continuation of embargoes on Cuba and Iraq, causing widespread misery in Cuba for lack of food and medicine, and hundreds of thousands of deaths in Iraq, according to UN statistics, and squandering vast funds on the U.S. military while people were suffering and dying at home and abroad due to lack of health care, nutrition, and housing. There was no second impeachment of Clinton after he used a diplomatic scam called the Rambouillet Accords to justify launching intensive U.S.-led NATO bombing of Yugoslavia in the spring of 1999 without congressional authorization. Clinton persisted with a continuous air war for more than 2 months, making history by violating the War Powers Resolution. Trump, like Barack Obama and George W. Bush before him, was able to order missile strikes and deploy troops in numerous war-torn countries without congressional constraints. And there was no reason to be concerned that Congress might impeach him for war crimes. The reasons for such impunity are rooted in the history of, quote, unimpeachable, unquote, offenses. Consider the proceedings in Congress that forced President Nixon to resign when impeachment was imminent in mid-1974. The House Judiciary Committee approved 3 articles of impeachment, focusing on his obstruction of justice after the break-in in Watergate by operatives for his re-election campaign, his misuse of federal agencies to violate the constitutional rights of citizens, and non-compliance with congressional subpoenas. Unmentioned in the Nixon impeachment articles, the Vietnam War that he had prolonged with a vengeance while claiming to seek peace. With methodical deception, he inflicted a massive, horrendous war, but his crimes against humanity were judged to be completely unimpeachable. Also entirely excluded from Nixon impeachment articles was the merciless U.S. bombing of the northern part of Laos that slaughtered people who lived on the Plain of Jars, making Laos, quote, the most heavily bombed country per capita in history, unquote. The impeachment articles likewise made no mention of Nixon's ordering of the secret and illegal carpet bombing of Cambodia, which began 2 months into his presidency and persisted year after year. On July 31st, 1973, nearly a full year after he resigned, Democratic representatives Robert Drinan introduced, nearly a full year before his resignation, there was a resolution for impeachment introduced by Drinan. He said it was triggered by the recent revelation that President Nixon conducted a totally secret air war in Cambodia. As journalist Judith Kober noted then, quote, the secret bombing of Cambodia involved the same abuse of power and political manipulation of government agencies as Watergate, but only a few congressional representatives like John Conyers, Elizabeth Holtzman, and Edward Mezvinsky supported Drinan's Cambodia article, which was soundly defeated by the House Impeachment Committee 26-12. Gerald Ford's, quote, only honest answer, acknowledging that an impeachable offense is only, quote, whatever a majority of the House of Representatives considers it to be at a given moment in history, unquote, foreshadowed the impeachment proceedings against Nixon, Clinton, and Trump. If what's impeachable is only what Congress members say it is, constituents should insist that the egregiously narrow definitions must no longer prevail. Otherwise, the operative standards for presidents will continue to be what they can get away with in tandem with the collectively feckless Congress. For now, the presidential offenses that are routinely considered unimpeachable and therefore ultimately acceptable tell us a lot about Congress and about the mass media in the U.S. and maybe about ourselves as well, says Norman Solomon. So this is providing context for what has been going on here and what went on in the first impeachment of Trump, but now what is going on in the second impeachment of Trump. And the final article I'll cover tonight is from Truth Out. And let me pick it up. It's from William Rivers Pitt. Is it from William Rivers Pitt? It is from William Rivers Pitt. And it is Democratic Party leaders are rushing through impeachment in lieu of a real trial. And we saw part of this today. Impeachment only on one article of impeachment. Pitt says, here we go again in more ways than one. Prepare to have your time wasted again. But this time it appears to be the Democrats who are prepared to hit the chicken switch. First impeachment of Donald Trump was an empty, rushed, and preordained affair. House Democrats had just captured the majority in the House, and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi knew a large swath of her caucus would erupt into discordant rebellion if the strident calls to impeach a rogue, renegade president were not heeded. And so they were, full in the knowledge that the effort was doomed in the Republican-controlled Senate. The trial after the impeachment came off like a junior high school theater club during a read-through of Our Town, and it ended with Trump's acquittal to the absolute surprise of nobody. Flash forward 13 months to the afternoon of January 6th, when the U.S. Capitol building looked as if it were under assault by a swarming army of red ants. Hours before, Trump had whipped his people into a frenzy and aimed them, but deliberately at the seat of Congress, where his final defeat at the hands of Joe Biden was being certified. The mob came closer to toppling a branch of the federal government than anyone knew that day. But as the details seeped out along with the videos, it became clear that many in that rage had come for blood. Stunned members of Congress told harrowing tales of near misses and close calls. Everyone knew this had been Trump's people doing his specific bidding, and the roar for a second impeachment became a thunder upon the land. Trump was impeached again, in about as much time as it takes to boil an egg, legislatively speaking. And 10 House Republicans joined with the majority. One of them was Liz Cheney, the House Republican conference chair and a senior leader of the party. Kevin McCarthy, the minority leader, did not vote to impeach, but said that Trump was responsible for the perilous events of January 6th. These two defections from the code of absolute loyalty have left Trump seething down in Florida ever since. The basis for the charges in the first impeachment trial were profound in scope and import, but by any reasonable metric, the charges this second time are more serious by orders of magnitude. Actually, my own opinion is that the charges in the first impeachment trial were not nearly serious enough and did not take into account the obvious violations of the Emoluments Clause, the war crimes, the violations of the War Powers Act, and all the rest that that was mentioned in the first article about impeachment and Trump. Anyway, the charges this second time are more serious by orders of magnitude, says Pitt, is what they would have charged Confederate President Jefferson Davis with had they ever brought him to trial. A sitting president incited a mob to violent action in the hope of overturning a fairly held election so he could remain in power. 5 people died, including a Capitol Police officer who was beaten to death with a fire extinguisher by a Trump supporter. Just a little more than a month has passed since that chaotic, lethal day. In that time, it appears the old ways of doing things on the Democratic side of the aisle have reasserted themselves. Instead of a trial showing all the available damning evidence of what took place that day and who is responsible on the Democratic congressional leadership, with the blessing of President Biden, appears poised to allow another impeachment rush job just to get it over with because the Republicans are unhappy. And Politico quotes, Democrats who struggled for years to hold Donald Trump accountable are at a crossroads again. Do they go all out to convict Trump by calling a parade of witnesses to testify to his misdeeds, or do they concede it's a lost cause, finishing the trial ASAP, and get on with Joe Biden's agenda? Several of the House impeachment managers wanted firsthand testimony to help prove their case that Trump incited the January 6th riot, our sources tell us. But Senate Leader Chuck Schumer and Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Biden administration officials, have been eager for the process to move quickly, we are told. It's been a source of frustration for some Democrats privately. Trump, these people have noticed, is already on the rebound politically, at least among Republicans. The GOP base has rallied his defense, and many Republican lawmakers who witnessed the terror of the Capitol invasion are back in Trump's corner. Schumer and other Senate Democrats argue, however, that they do not necessarily need witnesses since Trump's crimes were in plain sight and documented in videos and tweets. Privately, senior Democrats also note that 45 of the Republicans in the Senate have already decided they think the trial is unconstitutional because Trump is no longer president, so why bother dragging this out? Actually, one of the 45 senators on the Republican side changed his mind today. There was a second vote on the constitutionality after the first arguments were presented in the trial, in the impeachment trial, and that vote ended up being 56 to 44, with Senator Cassidy changing his vote, and he went over to the constitutional side, saying that he changed his mind after the arguments. So the Democrats got have gotten now 6 of the Republicans that they need. They still have another 11 to go, but that assumes those people who are voting for the constitutionality of the trial would all vote for the conviction of Donald Trump, and that's by no means uh, um, such an assumption is not necessarily true at all. Anyway, going on with the article, it's reached a point where you can set your watch to these Democratic waffles slithering off the griddle just when things get hot. Quote, why bother dragging this out, unquote. That such a question is even being contemplated speaks volumes about how and why this nation has gotten so far down in the ditch. You fight the fight because the fight is worth fighting. You act out of hope in more than just the outcome, because the effort yields its own rewards. You shout down hypocrisy for the sake of truth, period. If 45 GOP senators have incorrectly decided to hang their hat on a flawed constitutional defense, bring witnesses like influential Republican lawyer Charles J. Cooper to shoot down the argument. Better yet, let Trump shoot it down himself. Quote, I am here to tell you, dude does not agree that he is a former president, and he is not allowing anyone to describe him that way, unquote, explained Rachel Maddow last week. If that's the trapdoor they're going to use to try to get him out of his Senate impeachment conviction, he's going to fight it. He insists he cannot be called a former president. He must be called the 45th president. He's still using the presidential seal. There's no sign that he concedes that there's now a 46th president. And so he's an X. I mean, how many ticks are we away from him claiming that he is still in office, that he still has the powers of the presidency, that he's rightfully still president, unquote? That alone would be worth the price of admission. Make those 45 Republicans who could not imagine a world without Trump calling the shots sit through days of video and personal testimony describing a world with Trump calling the shots. Rub their noses in it like bad puppies. Rub the nation's post in it. And if they still won't act in the best interest of the nation, carve their names in stone and wait for 2022. But no, the Ents running the Democratic Party, Schumer, Pelosi, and Biden, have opted once again for the bended knee in the flabby name of expediency. The impeachment trial will be a sham, and when it is done, all those Congress people will head home through the war zone barricades that now drape the nation's capital. You'd think they might notice all that and act on it. You'd think they'd remember they were in the building and targets for violence a month ago. But this is not how we do things. I can't remember the last time it was. Pretty angry column by William Rivers Pitt, and pretty well written one as well. Okay. A couple of last words to what I want to talk about. First, note some other details from the aid package, of the Democrats. I talked about the expanded child tax credit, but there's also an extension of the supplemental unemployment benefits. They came in at $400 a week, which is up from the current $300. So to do that, the bill had to change the timeline for the expiration of the benefits. The original idea was to do $300 a week and to have the unemployment benefits run through September. Now they would run through the end of August in order to give people $100 more. But that also means the end of September is the end of the fiscal year, and Congress has to have all its extensions, its passage of further appropriations in place by the end of the fiscal year. But they don't have to have it in place by the end of August. Now, if we still have an employment problem, which we're bound to have by the end of August, I don't think we're going to get out of this so easily, that the economy will have completely come back, okay, by the end of August. Not with this one reconciliation bill. Seems to me the Democrats are assuming here that they are going to be able to get a second reconciliation relief bill. I guess this wouldn't be so much a relief bill as a real stimulus bill with infrastructure in it, green infrastructure, but probably also with an extension of unemployment benefits if people need it. And this suggests that those people who change this from 300 to 400 and are going to allow it to run out at the end of August are setting a deadline for themselves to get the new stimulus bill done by the end of August. So that, okay, is interesting. Okay. So I thought that you should know that. And then impeachment. Okay, impeachment. What's next up, okay, for impeachment is after the initial arguments today from the House impeachment managers, okay, and from the defense, okay, the Trump defense, there are still 16 hours of arguments or testimony, okay, or whatever, left for each side, okay, before this is over. So there's still the question of whether witnesses will be called. I think they probably won't be called yet, but who knows? There might be surprises. It may be that Donald Trump, okay, will decide that he wants to be a witness for himself. We'll have to see, okay, what actually happens. So that's coming up. The trial will continue tomorrow, okay, at noon. The first day was eventful in that some of the arguments, in particular, Jamie Raskin's, were very, very powerful. But still, the Republicans en masse are still sticking with Trump. Only one vote has been changed. So that's where it sits. Now we have the 16 hours of arguments on each side. So I'll go back now to your comments and begin to take them. I guess I ended with the Australian Open, and Steve staying. He can't stay. Kay said shared. Kay said, but yesterday he did that. Kay says Bernie posted yesterday that he did that. It's now in fighting with Manchin, right? Spelling on that K, Manchin. It's like not like actually Manchin. It's spelled like it's Manchin. Steve Gonzo says, yep, sparse crowd masked up. They had to lock down 72 players prior. Looks like just family and friend courtside. Above that, pretty empty. At least they're not on fire this year. But they're still very careful of COVID, in spite of the fact that they've performed very, very well. It's notable that they're very careful about not having crowds. They have, 3 35 deaths per million. I haven't checked them recently. Let's see. Australia. We're, by the way, at 1,444 deaths per million now. 479,545 deaths, all in all, here in the United States, according to the Worldometer site. And in Australia, still at 35 deaths per million. Okay, in Australia, total deaths 909. So in terms of deaths per million, the Australians have done roughly, 15 times better than the United States in deaths per million. Roughly that much. 15 times better than the United States. But in spite of that, they're careful to social distance. Much more careful than we were with the Super Bowl crowd. Joanne says, unless the homeless are included in relief, we're not helping them or the economy. Homelessness costs local governments and business dollars. Lana says, hi, folks. Hi, Lana. Kay says, I agree, Joanne. Johnny Garza says, Joe, long time no see, got lots to do. May I drop my webpage announcement? Sure. The revolution has begun. Started January 31st. To know you're part in it, go to the $dollarandthehero.org. Okay, and any of my videos at the $dollarandthehero.org. Okay, Johnny, thanks, I will. Videos here, so Johnny's got some videos on Facebook. Steve says Trump was beside himself with anger at the ineptitude of the attorneys that were representing him on the first day of the impeachment trial in the Senate. Well, I don't know whether they're inept or not, but I know he lost a bunch of first choice attorneys last week because he didn't agree with their strategy. So he's not going to agree with anybody. So he's just got to come and defend himself. He's just got to come and be his own lawyer. That's what I advise him to do. Of course, Ivanka, and Jared, are telling people we're okay on the impeachment front, but he can still blow it. He can still blow it. It's what they're letting people know. Kay says, oh, well, laugh out loud. Kay says he won't pay them anyway. That's LOL, Kay. That's LOL. He won't pay them anyway because he already said they're inept. I doubt his choice of words included ineptitude, laugh out loud. Nah, I think he knows ineptitude. He knows what that means, Steve Gonzo. Kay says, Evelina tonight. Evelina, upon you coming tonight? Evelina says, Kay Clark Ryan, in and out. Thank you, Kay. Barbara says, Johnny Garza suggesting a plan that deserves attention. It's a tried and true plan. We know it works. Please view. Okay. Holly Horn says, hello. Hello, Holly. Steve Gonzo says, Americans, we're dying. Republicans, good. But Democrats, we hear you and we honor your experience. Steve Gonzo says, Katie Johnstone Democrats want to lose the midterms. The problem with warning that the $2,000 check scandal will lead to losses in the midterms is that Democrats are fine with losing in the midterms. You think they like having to own all their right-wing bullshit for themselves? Democrats hate being exposed and vulnerable like this. They much prefer to blame their corporate cronyism, austerity policies, and warmongering on an obstructionist Republican Congress. they're happy to lose the midterm. I don't think they're happy to lose the midterm anymore. I don't think so. I don't think Jeff Merkley wanted to lose the midterm. I don't think Biden wants to lose the midterms. I don't think he wants to have to wrestle with the Republicans for the rest of what's likely to be a one-term presidency. I don't think he wants that. Lana says, boo Pete Peterson. And Lana says, CBO is a neoliberal too, only been around since the 1970s. Jesus, Lana, it's almost 50 years now. 2024, it'll be 50 years since it's been around. We need to scrap using them as the authority for new spending. They're rarely right in their analysis. I can't remember the last time they were right in their analysis. As I've often said, they can't accurately project out 6 months. Kay says, I had to go through the ache of reapplying for food stamps today. Shake my head. They would give me a little income and Social Security. It would be cheaper and easier for all concerned. It would be. Steve Gonzo says, if they can't get you to beg for it, it's assumed you don't need it. Kay says, sad but true, Steve Gonzo. Kay says, Canada just approved dose change to Pfizer vaccine to 6 doses? 6 doses? What do you mean 6 doses, Kay? Shake my head. But shake my head. Okay, my roommate just got his first dose at work today. Hope for me to be able to get the J&J one-shot one. Steve Wolfbrand said, I'm back. Steve says, your government's just not that into you. And Kay says, oh, can't stand Morning Joe? You mean Obama or what? Holly Horn says, this is awful. And Steve Gonzo says, I didn't know Joe was on in the morning. Steve says, different Joe. Steve Wolfram says, maybe I'll get lucky on the lottery scratches. If you do get lucky on the lottery scratches, Steve, then maybe you should go to New Zealand. All you'd have to do would be to quarantine for 14 days, which you could probably get through. And then you would be in a country which had only 5 fatalities per million. Or you could go to Taiwan, where they have only 0.3 of a fatality per million. That would be pretty good too. But if you insist on speaking English, then you might want to go to New Zealand. Kay says, I hope for you, Steve Wolfbrand, I have the luck of the Irish in the potato famine, laugh out loud. Holly Horn says, exactly, Dr. Firestone. Okay. Steve Wolfbrand says, sure seems that way, Doc, but you and Barney get vaccinated yet? We got our first shot of the Moderna vaccine close to 3 weeks ago. We're due to get our second vaccination on February 12th, which is this coming Friday. But there's a snowstorm we hear fixing to come this way, so we're hoping we will be able to drive between the snowflakes in order to get there on Friday. We have to drive a little ways to Tyson's Corner. It's about a 35-minute drive to get there because that's where Kaiser Permanente is doing the vaccines. And we do have a local Kaiser, but they're not doing any vaccinations there. Actually, the local Kaiser is maybe 7 minutes away from us or something like that. But anyway, that's the way it is. So Steve says, you all see that video they played today at the impeachment? I did. That was pretty powerful. Did see that. It was pretty powerful. Steve Gonzo said it looked like the Lincoln Project actually produced it. And Steve Wilkins, yeah, Doc, Clinton did all that and worse, including moving cocaine out of Mena Airport while governor. But they impeached him for a blowjob. Silly. Yeah, but he wasn't convicted. because the Senate didn't want to convict him for a blowjob. And Kay says, Steve Gonzo, they didn't have to, as it is history, says Kay to Steve Gonzo. Steve Wolfbrand said Giuliani suggested trial by combat. What is this, the Middle Ages? Oh, you mean a trial between Trump and Biden? Trial by combat? Okay. I mean, I think Biden would win that. They could have a push-up contest. Biden would certainly win that. Steve Gonzo said, Serena Williams, FTW, no masks at her match. They must all be in a bubble. They probably can't breathe through the masks. But at least they're outdoors. Aren't they outdoors? Steve says, Australia. Steve says, release the Kraken. Kay says, watch out for March 4th. Yeah, what happens March 4th? And Lana Dell says, ha, bad puppies. Steve Gunn says, Trump jacked up room prices ×3 on the 4th. Oh, I understand Trump can't make any money at the Trump Hotel in D.C. anymore. And he's no longer president. Nobody stays there. Steve Wolfbrand said the Ides of March. That's the 15th. Steve says, ha. Kay says, might be at another insurrection or something. Yes, Steve, I have been seeing the story too. He's expecting something to happen. Lana says, Jordan Chariton is upset that Raskin used some of their footage without credit or any payment. Jordan, you should be upset about that. But if Raskin can get a conviction, maybe not too upset about that. But it's just like them not to give credit to somebody who's a small guy and who sweats for a living. I don't mean to suggest that Jordan is a small guy, just part of the alternative media, like the rest of us, struggling to become reasonably successful so they can continue to do the work and to have the voice that they want to have. Steve Wolfbrand said, to impeach a man for not refusing a blowjob, well, 99% of American males are guilty as hell. Steve, I'm not aware that Monica offered it. It seems to me that's what he probably demanded. Steve said, we need some stinking badges. Lana said, who said, quote, only a fool represents himself in court? I think it was probably a lawyer who said that. Steve Gonzo said, Trump has the best aptitude. Lana says, Kay, I hate it they put you through having to reapply for food stamps. What a runaround. Kay says, Global News reported about Canada increasing doses. Lana says, I know where Tyson's Corner is. My favorite Middle Eastern restaurant was there. I miss it. What was your favorite Middle Eastern restaurant? What was it, Lana? There are a number of Middle Eastern restaurants there. Kay says, I miss all the online news. I used to watch all day. They're suffering too because of the pandemic. Okay, I've reached the end of your comments. Any last comments? It was called Shim-Shari. Shim-Shari. Have we ever been to Shim-Shari?
No, I don't think so.
The name is familiar.
It's familiar, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Is that the Iranian restaurant? It's in Tyson's Corner, not too far from what used to be the Sheraton Hotel. I don't know if it's still the Sheraton Hotel. I haven't been paying attention. Anyway, I could almost picture the street it's on. And Lana says, real Muslims, great food, no booze, haha. Yes, I think I know that one. Okay, it's an Iranian restaurant, and they had really great bread and great hummus and other very good things. Steve says, good night, sweet dreams until we meet again. Good night, Steve. And Lana says, real Muslims, great food, no booze. Haha. And Lana says, yes, fab food. So I recall it wasn't that expensive for Washington, D.C. area. And then Dolores says, thank you and good night all. Okay, and Lana says, I thought maybe they closed. I don't know. I don't know. I will be glad if they're still open. I'll go check. Shim Shirley, a chimney's lucky as lucky can be. Case says, good night all. Thank you for a great discussion. I love you all. If I recall the name, I think it was actually spelled like this. I am writing it in the comments. Lana says, first time I tried rose ice cream. Yeah. And made with rose petals. Lana says, good night. And Steve Gonzo says, chim chim chiroo. Now I got to Google Sham Cherie see if it's still there. And now that I remembered how to spell it. And Rahul says, Alana says, yes, you may be right about the spelling. Okay, that's pretty important for the Googling. And Rahul Majumdar says, came late, rest in peace. Mary Wilson of the Supremes. I didn't realize that she had died. Okay, did she just die? Steve Wolfbrand said, good luck will rub off when I shake hands with you. Thank you, Steve. Whoever that's addressed to, thank you. So Mary Wilson, rest in peace. Thank you all for coming. I will see you tomorrow. I'll be talking some healthcare tomorrow and also impeachment because there'll be some impeachment news. And I'm sure I might have some economic analysis tomorrow too. Maybe further words about how crazy Larry Summers is. Anyway, good night and sleep tight, everybody.